My name is Mike Woodruff. It's my privilege to introduce the upcoming interview that you have a chance to listen to. It's with Dr. John Inazu, who is a professor of law, Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Inazu has a PhD in political theory from the University of North Carolina, where he studied, in particular, he studied the First Amendment and the aspect of the First Amendment that deals with the right of assembly. So the First Amendment has got freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble. He also did a law degree at Duke University. He has a military background. He's a big devotee of Henry Nouwen. And he's written a couple books. So I first met John, 10 years ago at a conference for the Murdoch Charitable Trust. And then read his book, Principled Pluralism. And then I read his book, Uncommon Ground. We handed that out. I talk about that a little bit in the session, in the interview. But then what we were talking with him about in this session is Learning to Disagree, which is his new book, which just came out. It's his Zondervan Press book. It's not necessarily a Christian book, although he is a Christian, and he writes from that vantage point talking about how do we disagree? It's not how do we get along necessarily, or how do we reach consensus as much as it is how do we learn to listen. It's an interesting book. I commend it to you. Dr. Inazu gave a brief set of introductory remarks that we were not able to record per a prior agreement. He's giving this talk all over, and he didn't want it on the web. But then I interview him for 45 minutes, asking him about the book, asking him about his opening comments. And so we pick up with my interview of Dr. John Inazu for this Lake Light lecture. Enjoy. So John and I, our paths have crossed a couple times at various events, and I was thrilled when I heard that he was going to be in town. I may be So we were talking beforehand, and I had discovered this afternoon 58,000 books sold, 58,000 different books sold last year. So it was a lawsuit, and it forced all the publishers to come forward with their numbers. And so there's 58,000 books that came on the market last year. 50% of them sold less than 12 copies. So I have given away more of your first two books.
You have.
I put you in the top half. So
Thanks,
I feel
Mike.
like your book on confident pluralism from, 5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago?
8 years ago.
8 years ago. And then a bunch of people, the book that you co-authored with Tim Keller, sort of you edited, you got a bunch of people to write stories about pluralism. We actually, one of the very first things that Lake Light did when we were sort of trying to figure out our place and our space is we invited 8 college, mostly presidents, for a discussion about pluralism on college campuses. And we used your book. So I handed out a bunch of copies then. And now we're doing this thing for your new book.
I love it. I will say, with Uncommon Ground, Tim and I gave all the proceeds to charity. So
okay. This
one, you can hawk it.
Push it. Okay. You don't care if they read it, you just want them to buy it. That's, yeah. Okay, well, so thank you for being here. And in the foreword to your book, the book on Learning to Disagree, Tish Warren writes about the fact that you have the gift of complexifying things. And I'm sure there's a lawyer joke in there, because that is what I think lawyers do, is complexify things. But hopefully there's a simplicity on the other side of that complexity. And so I read the book, and by the way, the book is very, very accessible, very easy, very, two things gripped me about it, and I guess I'll ask you to respond. One, you chose to write it so it's the first year of law school. You sort of go through every month what's happening in law school and talking about what you're trying as a professor to teach students, and interacting with some of the things that are happening in your own life and your observations. And so it just makes it more of a narrative. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, so the first book that I read of yours was more didactic and deep and weighty, more of an academic book. And then the book with Keller is more stories. And then this is stories a little bit lighter. Is this a trend line? And is it sort of a concession to what you're learning as a writer and how hard people are willing to work on these kinds of things? Or why did you write the book the way you wrote it?
Yeah, no, I like the question because it does pick up on a trajectory of sorts. People are reading fewer books. We just heard evidence of that. People aren't reading long books as much. And so it was just intuitive to me that people are not going to read or want to read dense academic books. I mean, there are people like me who still read those books because we get paid to do it, but your average person just trying to figure out how do I disagree with, Uncle Frank better is not going to want to read an academic treatise on the nature of disagreement. So it occurred to me that storytelling would be a better way into that. And
I think Jesus sort of picked up on
Jesus
that
is pretty good at
idea.
this too. There's some good models. That's right. And also though, but what I realized was a narrative arc that takes place over the course of a year allows me to tell stories through people as well and show change and growth in people, which is not something that you would do with an academic treatise, and that's more human. And so my kids who tell me I complexify too much, they also say that that's more human.
Okay. Well, the other thing that struck me about the book was, wow, isn't this interesting that it's being written by a lawyer? And if it had been written 40 years ago, I think it would have been written by a pastor. And if it was written 30 years ago, it would have been written by a therapist. And if it was written 20 years ago, it would have been written by a management consultant. And now it's being written by an attorney. And is that because everything is sort of grinding down to the law? Or, I mean, you didn't, in fairness, it doesn't read like you're a lawyer. And I realize, and
Thank you.
there's a lot more heart and empathy and concern to teach people how to think. And I know you've got a background as an engineer, and then you were in the military, and you've done some work around Henry Nouwen, and then you've got a PhD in political theory, and you got a law degree, and so you're bringing a lot of things to this discussion. But you did write it as a lawyer. You didn't write it as a political theorist. You didn't write it it's not a Henry Nouwen book. It's not an engineering book. I've never read an engineering book, so I can't say that for sure, but sure didn't read like an engineering book. Is that where we're going? That's just the only overlap of the Venn diagram is the law?
Well, so I've got a theoretical answer and then a personal answer. The theoretical answer is there is an argument in some pockets of the academy that would say lawyers are essentially America's new priests. And why is that? Because we turn to the law to resolve or attempt to resolve our deepest moral disagreements in ways that we would have gone in earlier societies to clergy to help resolve. So we tend to put way too much weight on the law in this country to resolve some of these moral disputes, but that is perhaps one reason why the topics, when I think about the topics that I teach in a class like criminal law or law and religion, where these profound moral issues that implicate the nature of a human being and that implicate lots of really hard zero-sum questions, those are all legal issues today. On a personal level, and this is where I think I'm probably not a typical lawyer, I feel like I learned all of my social skills being a Young Life leader back in the day and just trying to relate to people normally. And when I think about what I do as a teacher, a lot of what I do with students feels pastoral or counseling in a sense. It's listening to the stories of people's lives and not just what do I need to know for the exam. And it's entertaining questions of doubt and hope and all kinds of ideas around the human beings who come across my classes and in my office. And so I think I've written it maybe more out of that frame than the academic lawyer frame.
So is that common as a law professor? So when I was at seminary, and I've got fraternity brothers, and we all went to grad school. So most went to law school, they got MBAs, you got med school, dental school. And when I was listening to them, especially the lawyers, my take was, they're trying to flunk these guys out. And my professors, very much, we were on a team. Like, we want to help prepare you to go out and to pastor churches. And so I felt like my professors were behind me. My assumption was that I'm thinking back to Paper Chase and whatever kind of, the cold calls. You talk about this, I'm gonna say, Johnson, stand up. What are the facts on this? And humiliate this student, and you live in fear. But that's not the way you describe your classroom and your relationship to your students and your concern for them. So is that common?
I mean, I think legal education has changed since the days of the paper chase. There are fewer people out there just trying to do the intimidation tactic. I think the student generation has changed too. A lot more students are coming in and saying, we want more engagement on a personal level, voicing everything from mental health concerns to deeper work-life balance sorts of issues. And in some ways, I mean, back in the day, 100 years ago, you would have faculty who served as counselors and mentors to students. That was just part of the job. And then over the last few decades, we've outsourced that to the student life side of the university, and you hire a bunch of non-faculty administrators to fill that role. And I think increasingly students, those administrators do important work, and also students want to hear from faculty, do you care about me as a person? Are you willing to engage in the fullness of who I am? And so I love that change, and I have only so much time in the day, but to the extent that I can, I want to engage holistically.
So you talk, and this book is sort of mapping out, learning to disagree, and you're talking about empathy and listening and humility and how you're going to try and coach people to understand the other person's position and then to be gracious and to move them forward. So, okay, that's very non-legal to me. And I guess I was just trying to, is law school teaching that because people don't get that?
Well, I mean, and Jill opened by saying the common impression of lawyers as the people who are stubborn and argumentative, and some lawyers earn that reputation, but I'm trying to make the case
You're not going to redeem the law profession.
Well,
here,
I'm going to
right?
give it a try, right? Unless the billable hour is still out there for sure, but I think that the best lawyering and the best legal education is one that sets up people to learn the absolute best version of the other side of the argument, to learn the fullness of the other side, sometimes because you just want to understand why your side is better, but also when you think about what lawyers have to do, they have to go before a judge or a third party and then say why they should win. And it's seldom going to work to show up there and say, they're idiots and we're right. So what you've got to do is say, there's a really good argument over this complex issue, and it turns out that we have an even better one, and this is why you have to listen to us. And you can only get there by understanding the other argument, and that itself, whether you want it to be or not, is a step toward empathy, because it's putting yourself more fully, more intellectually, more experientially into the other side's argument. And that, when you can teach that and when you can learn that well, that's the very best kind of lawyering, and it turns out to be very applicable to ordinary relationships as well.
Yeah, I very much want to believe that. It strikes me that a lawyer wants to learn the way the other side thinks, both principally so they can unmask it. I love the way that you're saying that also provides some level of common ground and a recognition of their humanity, and I'd love to think that it would soften them. I guess I don't want to be cynical. I'm just skeptical that that's what is doing. But your book was sort of suggesting that, and I appreciate it that way. When I was a management consultant for 8 years, part of what I did struck me as people would say, "How did you end up to be a management consultant? I mean, you can't do that. You didn't train for that." And I would say, well, a lot of it is just sort of Christian common sense. I just feel like you try and care for people and you listen. And you resolve, lots of the departments have got communication issues, and they've also got conflict. And the tool that I would use over and over was to say, okay, you guys disagree, tell me your side. And then I would point to this person and say, okay, tell me what he said. And that could take, so this person would start not prepared to say that your side of the story, right? They're prepared to say their side of the story, haven't really been listening, so then they fumble at it. And this person says, see, I told you that's not what I said at all. And go back and forth, and it would take a long time before this person could repeat to that person's satisfaction their side. And then we would do it back. And a lot of times that would solve a lot of the problems. But it would certainly tease out, these are the critical issues that we've got to work on. And that was I think that's a skill you learn doing ministry, right? You just learn you learn it as a young life leader. You learn it as in other ways. So I just found it fascinating. You were spending time in law teaching empathy and compassion and understanding the humanity of the other person and seeing that as a real, part of what you're trying to do to help resolve disagreements.
And part of this within law is a kind of reform effort too. I think lawyers and doctors often have the reputation of being the people who are so professionally and clinically oriented that it's easy to forget about the humanity of the person in front of them. And maybe some of us have experienced this at the hospital where the surgeon doesn't seem he actually cares about you. And I think the challenge in both of those professions is to be very good at what you do. I want my law students to be extremely clinical when they hear a hard or an offensive or an off-putting argument, and just be able to go laser in on how to respond in the best possible way, and at the same time to retain their humanity so that they're not forgetting about the person across from them or themselves. When you go into these fields of work, you encounter hard places and hard arguments, and to become immune to those is to lose a bit of your own humanity. So there is a balance in a dance, but the best kind of professionalism and the best kind of lawyering is going to look a lot more like this than purely doing the technical stuff. Okay,
so I want to bring this into real life here.
That was also real life.
Okay, yes. Fair enough. We won't disagree over that point. We might disagree over what comes next. So I want to ask how you would be applying this in 3 different scenarios. So we'll start with the university. I'm going to go global scene, and I'm going to go Thanksgiving dinner table. But right now, universities are, they're in some, not all, but some are in absolute meltdown. Lots of protests, contentious college presidents. Some seem to be bested by the arguments or just by the force or by the anger or by whatever is going on. So you did your PhD on the right to assemble. You are a First Amendment scholar around the right to assemble. You're writing on disagreement. You're writing on staying in these contentious conversations and listening. So it doesn't seem to me like one party on these campuses is interested in listening to the other party at all. And there's a power dynamic. What would you do if you were the president of, pick a school, Columbia, Yale, NYU? Is anything happening at WashU right now?
Yeah, so yesterday afternoon I walked over to campus and there was a big protest, and eventually the police arrested 80 protesters. And so, yeah, this is a very live issue on my campus as well. What to do about it? This is such an important and complex issue that is a nice case study of the kinds of things that I'm getting at in this book as well. So I guess the first point is, as someone who studies protests and advises a lot of protesters, I do think there are moments to intervene with power dynamics and to disrupt sort of status quo norms. So the way to put this is that sometimes calls for civility are often efforts by people in power to tell people
reinforce the status quo.
Yeah, or just be patient, it'll all work out. And so there is a moment and a time for strategic incivility. it's not clear to me that the current protests we're seeing are quite harnessing that moment or expressing that. And so, I witnessed a lot of sort of very hateful chants and what seemed to me to be pretty short-sighted kinds of efforts that were far from the kinds of protests I've seen work effectively in, say, civil rights context. So I don't know quite what is going on there. What would I do if I were the university president? I guess the first question is, am I the president of a private university or a public university? Because there are big differences there about how and why I would respond. But I think what I worry about in all of these contexts is that it's almost the work that's trying to be done now, it's almost coming too late, because we're hearing these leaders saying, this is our community, this is the purpose of our institution as an educational institution, but that work really hasn't been done for a long time. You have to lay the groundwork of your purpose, mission, and values way before the crisis point hits. And you've got to reinforce that over and over with liturgies, and especially with a university where the student population turns over every 4 years. You've got to get people on board to a common mission and a common community. One that I would think at the very least, would say, on an issue as fraught as the current geopolitical one, to recognize that there are people within this community that are deeply hurt and scared at a very real human level on both sides of this issue. That we're not just talking about abstractions, but there are people in our community, and we should start by asking, how do we care for them? And then second, we're an educational institution. And if we can't bring hard ideas with a certain mode of discourse and temperament here, then where else in society are we going to do it?
So let's, just because it's perhaps particularly fraught, the Hamas, Gaza, Israel situation, let's set that one aside and say college campuses for the last few years have had a cancel culture. They have had a radical, there's just been a lot of ideologies that have changed the university environment. University of Chicago, as I understand it, has this, any idea can be expressed, and you can't protest that idea and say, I find that offensive, I'm threatened, trigger warning, whatever. So are you arguing, are you advocating that there needs to be training to get people to that point? I guess I read in reading your book, I found myself saying, I like all of this. And to be fair, John, I say what you say when people are coming at me. Like, look, we need to be humble, we need to love, we need to be patient, we need to keep going, right? We got to do the next right thing. I don't know what else to do. I don't always have much optimism that it's going to work, but I have hope and I have a call, and this is my call, and this is what I'm certain of. But I hear the pushback. You're being naive. You're just being naive. It's not going to work, and we're going to lose. And so I say that to you. You're being naive.
Yeah, maybe, but you raised a lot of points there, and I want to kind of unpack them a bit. But let me start with the last one. From a Christian perspective, winning or losing is not the ball game here. It's how we live faithfully in the world, knowing that we're part of a much larger story unfolding over thousands of generations, and we're just bit players. The kingdom of God does not depend on what happens in the United States in 2024, right? So we know already, like, we are, and that's step one as Christians. Now, the harder question, I think, is where you started with the specific institutional framework of the modern university campus. And here I would say that first of all, to recognize what the campus is about, and this is my earlier point about not understanding the purpose or mission of the university today, I actually don't think I think the cancel culture narrative is overblown, and here's why. I teach at a very progressive school where some of these things happen, and when they happen, they are awful, and they do happen, and when you read about them in the news, they are accurately describing some of the things that happen, and there are real costs to those things, and people are stigmatized, and there are deeply worrisome consequences of when those things happen. And they happen a few times a year. And
You write in your book about the Stanford.
Yeah, no.
Maybe you want to explain that, just to put that in the context.
Well, I mean, so I've been protested. I've been parts of protests that become very dicey to me. Even as a tenured faculty member, I think, where's my reputational status going in the next few hours or few days? And those are not pleasant experiences. This one protest that I discuss in the book took 200 hours of my time to resolve. So these are major issues when they flash up. But this is the other important point I want to make. They happen a few times a year, and the other 250, 300 days I'm on campus are pretty normal, with students learning and teachers teaching, and an ecosystem trying to do its best to be an educational institution. So I think what I worry about sort of the media narrative about higher ed today is it's way too binary. There's a left media that's saying things are fine, and there's a right media that's saying it's a dumpster fire, and it's neither of those. It's a complex community that, for the most part, is I think, trying to stumble along into its educational mission. But then the next point I would say is everybody needs to be on board with what that mission is. And where I see things go off the rails is when you have typically a student group saying, we need to fill a room with this big event, so we're going to bring in the bomb thrower to talk about controversial issue X. And then suddenly the bomb thrower comes onto campus, and that person has no interest in the purpose mission of the institution. That person doesn't care about the educational enterprise, is not interested in the modes of discourse, and so that blows up, and there's a protest and a counter-protest, and sometimes I wish, where are the adults in the room, the administrators, the teachers, to help students to realize you don't need to bring in the bomb thrower, rent a smaller venue, bring in a less exciting speaker who can actually talk about the issues within the mode of discourse to which we're committed. And that would be beautiful and wonderful to see in the university. So I think all of this is possible. It's hard. I don't want to sugarcoat it. Like I said, I've had my own experiences. I love protesters until they protest me. But it's also, there's a lot of good there. And part of what I would love to see Christians to see more of is the good that is in the university, the good that is in these hard places that seem very lost to us, but also are places where there's a lot of real opportunity and beauty.
So are you an advocate of the University of Chicago?
Oh, I think they're fine. I mean, I think they do some things well and other things less well. I mean, I do think that something like intellectual diversity is really important in higher ed, and a lot of schools lack it, and Chicago typically does better with it. It's also a nice branding thing for them, so I don't want to give them too much credit. But no, I think it's an important conversation to keep having. When I should also say this, like I think that the university, I think higher ed in general is kind of doomed, so I don't want to be like a higher ed apologist here. I think most of these places, they're so baked into a path dependency that has been aimless and purposeless for generations now that they're not going to recover. So they're going to have, at the very top, very powerful institutions with a ton of resources and not knowing what their purpose is. And still, there's a place for Christians to be part of those institutions, to work for the sake of human flourishing and the witness of the gospel, and to have students and teachers and others there who are part of it.
So let me. I think I want to leave the whole world aside for just a second.
That's fair. We were covering a lot of ground here.
We've talked about higher ed. Let's bring it to the Thanksgiving table, or just the family dynamic. And so it's a cliche today to talk about Thanksgiving. You know, you got your lefty sister-in-law who's whatever, as far left as can be, and you got crazy Uncle Buck who's as far right as can be, and you're just going, how in the world are we going to hold this thing together? Because one of them is going to say something that's going to set the other one off, and we're going to have a food fight, and it's going to be bad.
By the way, it's always, I mean, I do this too, but it's always like the conservative uncle and the liberal sister, right? Like,
well, it could be.
Sometimes I'm going to mix this up.
I'm glad to mix it up. Yes. It can be the college student that comes home that has learned everything and is, going to throw the bomb on the middle of the table. Yes, all kinds of people can do this. So you talked about your dad and that the challenges and the hurt and the estrangement, and you've written a book on this. So let's just talk about family dynamics. There are people in the room, I'm sure, that can't go to Thanksgiving this year or can't invite everybody back to Thanksgiving, whatever. There's just too much contention. So what is your counsel to them? You've written a book. So other than buy the book and read the book, what is your counsel?
Yeah, one quick story before I answer that. I was meeting with a political scientist last week, and she does more empirical research, and she told me there's a study out that actually tracked, it's a little scary because they use cell phone data, but they tracked the average length of Thanksgiving dinner pre-2016 and post-2016, and it went down dramatically. Yeah. So this is a real thing, right? So what do you do about it? Well, I guess a couple of things. One, you're not going to change anybody's vote between now and November. So if you've got some burden on your heart to change a vote, it's not going to happen. So play the long game, step back and think, if you care about this person or these people, what does the relationship look like for the course of the years to come, and how do you work on building trust? And this is the related point. It comes up in my story with my dad as well. Often what I hear from students and others is you think, I feel like I don't even know this person anymore. What happened? And part of the answer is you don't know that person anymore, because you've gone off to college, or you moved cities, or you haven't talked in a while. It's just been vacations back home. And over the course of years, you've been formed differently by news sources and relationships and echo chambers. And I think the fraughtness of family is you come back expecting a certain baseline that may no longer be there. And so step one is, if you care about it, how do I work to restore a basic relationship? And that might mean not talking politics, but actually working on some kind of common ground before that. And so I would say set modest goals, but set ones that are rooted in relationships and trust. And then, in some cases, you are going to have to take a risk and engage a little more deeply or concretely. And in those cases, too, I think there's a tendency where we want to say, well, let me tell you why my side is the right one. This is sort of like what you were saying earlier. But you could start with, why don't you tell me why you believe this and what you think about it? And to be open to learning what this other person has to say. This is also true in interfaith contexts. You don't want to be the Christian who walks in the room and your only goal is to convert the person of the other faith. That's not going to be a very effective form of witness or friendship, for that matter. But to be open to say, like, tell me your questions about my faith. Tell me why you believe what you believe, and to invite a conversation rather than just a preaching session. That's a step to start to engage. And then if you're going to challenge perspectives or positions, then at least do the work of trying to get to news sources and authorities that are not going to be immediately dismissed by the person you're speaking to. So if Uncle Buck, who we're now saying is the conservative uncle, disagrees with you, don't give him a New York Times article to read. Find something closer to his epistemic authority structure and say, actually, this guy you like kind of made this point too, and do the work to understanding your audience, right, and contextualizing your arguments.
I'm just reminded, thank you. I'm reminded of what G.K. Chesterton said. So this is 100 years ago. Someone was asking him, how do I talk my neighbor out of their conspiracy? They believe a conspiracy. How do I talk them out of it? And he said, you don't. You invite them over and you go on a walk. You build a friendship. You're friends. You spend time. You invite them over. You care for them. I've had very, very little success in the last 5 years of talking anybody out of a position. It seems like the divide is deeper, and people are less patient. Those conversations are just harder. As a political scientist, would you agree? I mean, we hear that the country is more polarized, and you said it's not as polarized. I mean, We can say it's not as polarized as the Civil War. In the 19th century, it was worse. But would you agree that things are dicier than they were?
I mean, it was worse in the 1860s. It was also worse in the 1920s and the 1960s. It was far worse for people of color in past eras. So, I mean, the polarization piece, I want to say this is worrisome. Be concerned. Social media and algorithms and declining trust in institutions are all real things that really matter and are stark right now. And we've had it far, far worse in many periods of our history. And I don't think, I mean, you mentioned a minute ago, you have not been successful in persuading people. The book is not called Achieving Consensus, it's Learning to Disagree. So I do want us to take seriously that we are going to continue to have these disagreements. And I think the modest hope is that there are people who feel very passionately on two sides of an issue who can start to empathize a little bit with the disagreement. Where that's not going to go are to the people who are just living in a different reality, and that's happening more and more, right? So I wouldn't go on the walk with the person who isn't sure what day of the week it is, or who the president of the United States is. I mean, right, there are people in categories who are living in alternate realities right now. That's a very real political problem. I don't know how to solve it, but I don't think going on a walk and trying to understand both sides is going to be useful. Where I would say
no, I think what he was saying is you're not talking about this at all. You're just going on a walk. You're just going to go fly a kite. You're just gonna have a meal and enjoy each other's company and try and reestablish the friendship, which is something you write about.
Yeah, for sure. And this is, I mean, I think a lot of us feel this viscerally with our online interactions. And part of the reason there is it's not just that we're only going on the walks, we're doing none of the walks with the people online. We're just getting these sound bites right back and forth in these comment sections. So I think the walk is actually essential. It just doesn't always have to be only the walk.
So you talked a little bit about your father. In the book, you talk about Jennifer Chang, and that's sort of one of the ongoing. Explain that and why you wrote about that.
So I have a couple of characters I develop in the book. All of the characters outside of my family are composites, especially when I was talking about colleagues. I had to be very clear that they were composites. So this student is also a composite character, but she in the book represents sort of a series of students who I've supervised with independent studies. So they'll come to me and say, I want to write a thesis on X, Y, or Z, and we'll sit down and talk about it. And they're usually, as I write about in the book, it's hard on the teaching side because on the one hand, it's intellectually wonderful and I get to learn this person's thinking at a far deeper level, but it's also a ton of time and it just doesn't fit in the normal teaching rhythms. But I'll end up doing, one or two of these a year. And in this particular case, which builds on some actual real cases, the student was brilliant, but also just incredibly narrow and closed-minded and was not interested in receiving my feedback. And it was very clear that she had a certain conception of her project that hadn't been exposed to a bunch of other literature and ideas that I knew about and was trying to get her to engage in. And so over the course of talking with her and meeting with her and reading her drafts, it's just going nowhere. And I finally conclude in the book, this is kind of a tragic moment because here's someone who's obviously brilliant, a wonderful writer, who is just going to be unteachable. And then later on, when she turns in her final thesis, it's remarkable, and she has figured it out. And it's a stunning, nuanced product that encompasses my feedback and actually goes beyond it. And it was one of those teaching moments that just feels incredibly rare but incredibly valuable. Sometimes in real life this happens years later. I'll get a student who will write me and say, it turns out that thing you said 4 years ago was right. And so that's a really delayed gratification. It's hard to rest your ego on that, but it is good, and it's very gratifying when you realize that we're all works in progress, even me on the teaching side, that I have things to learn about my own biases and my assumptions about students.
So back to the Thanksgiving table. Would you set, would you set ground rules? Would you coach people before they get there? Would you?
I love this question. This is also like a little bit above my pay grade, right? At some point, like some of you should just go talk to a counselor before you do this, and like
You're the priests of the 21st century.
I can just give you ideas and big picture ideas, but for the non-specialist, I'm just a simple caveman lawyer here. I would say make sure you're going in on a full tank, right? To make sure that you are yourself rested and not afraid, and you prayed about this, and that you have an access that when that first offensive comment comes, because it will come, that you have enough capacity in you to receive it and not respond. And maybe even that simple act of not responding as anticipated or as you have in past interactions is enough to just kind of throw things off, enough to just put a wedge in there. But beyond that, talk to a counselor.
Yeah. No, I think the idea of having a rested tank is important, because it's when I don't that you lose the ability to be the hopeful, non-anxious presence that can absorb some of the pain. And I think that's part of what the church can do and is going to need to do, is to take some of the pain out of the equation, take some of the noise out of the room and just absorb it. And certainly Jesus did that for us, and it is part of the call. Yeah.
And these are the other thing, though, is these are the things we have to work on, the practices and habits, well before that actual hard conversation, especially when the stakes are very high. If we haven't practiced this a lot, then we're foolish to go in and think we're going to act differently than the way we've been formed, say, on social media for the past weeks and months. So maybe the predicate question is to ask ourselves, what are we doing in our own daily practices that are going to ensure we are the people who are patient and listening and able not to take offense in the moment? And if we can't answer that question, it might not be a great idea to start the conversation.
So, pretty much out of time here, John, but let me ask maybe two final questions. So, we haven't really talked about your philosophy around pluralism, but you sort of hinted at this, like, this isn't how to reach consensus. It's how to live with disagreement. And I guess to combine my question, two questions. Are you optimistic that we can reach some sort of principled, confident pluralism and hold things together?
I don't know. I think when you think about the nature of our disagreements today, what is the purpose of the country? What's the meaning of human flourishing? What counts as a human being? These are not small questions, and it's very hard to see how we kind of recover any sort of consensus around them. So the stark reality of our deep differences gives me concern. This is to say, pluralism and difference is not just a uniform good. It creates a lot of tragedy and hardship in our society. Will we be able to work through them? I guess I'm optimistic because I'm not sure what other choice we have, and I would want Christians to be part of the mix. I would want lawyers to be part of the mix. When you think about what's at stake, the way in which we resolve our hardest disagreements in this country, we might not like it. It might feel imperfect. It might feel too political. It might feel like the powerful people win. But it's different than street violence. And street violence is happening in parts of the world today, and it's happened in lots of human history. So to work responsibly and productively and untiringly toward the continuation of the democratic experiment that lets us resolve our disagreements over fundamental matters through these means and not purely violent means seems like something to be optimistic about.
Okay. So, what are you working on next?
Oh, trying to rest, I guess.
Okay. Be ready for Thanksgiving?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Okay, let's thank John.
Great. Thanks, Mike.